Randy, the natural Couture. Randy, Manchester's a familiar place. You fought here, UFC 105 against Brandon Vera. What was that experience like? How great is it to be back out here now?
Well, it's awesome to be back. Yeah, that was a great fight. It was a fun show. It was nice that, I come in and try to get acclimated to the time change, and you want to try and train at fight time, which is at 9 o'clock at night here. So, and there was nothing open, so the JKD gym here opened up for us every night and let us train at 9 o'clock at fight time, so that we were ready to go on fight night on Saturday. And that was really cool of him to do that. And then he would walk us down to Chinatown, because that was the only place we could find food later at night to be able to eat something after training. So it was a challenge, always a challenge with the time change, trying to get acclimated to being in Europe versus fighting in the States.
100%, and then on that card as well, you had Michael Bisping, Dan Hardy. That was the start of the UK revolution that we're seeing now. It's absolutely crazy over here. I know that we've been speaking with Tom Aspinall as well. The future of the heavyweight division, we're all hoping, and we can all see him being a future champion in this country. What's it been like chatting with him?
I don't get on the mat with the big guys anymore. My neck won't take it. So I haven't had a chance. I trained a little bit with Francis, but he's really the only one that I've been on the mat with at the gym. I honestly only have one speed, so I can't. I have to take care of the neck, or I'll end up having to have a neck surgery, and I don't really want to do that. So.
Being one of the forefathers of MMA, you were there from the get-go. You had a military background where you was wrestling and boxing, a massive wrestling pedigree as well. Coming into the sport, what would you know what to expect at that time? It was jiu-jitsu. The jiu-jitsu guys wearing gis, the wrestling guys wearing shoes. It was bare knuckle. It was Mark Coleman headbutting you from the top. It was nuts, right?
Yeah, it was a different animal back then. You absolutely could get in by filling out an application. There was no amateur divisions. There was no way to work your way up. It was a lot different back then. I think back in that I call the first generation of MMA, everybody was out to prove that their style was the best style. And I think what we quickly realized was that there was no one style that encompassed everything you needed to know in mixed martial arts. And that's when we started cross-training, trying to learn the other stuff. And that's what I call, we transitioned into that second generation of mixed martial artists that kind of put their background, mine was wrestling, some guys were jiu-jitsu, other guys were kickboxing or boxing. You kind of put that traditional background to the side and put yourself in a bunch of uncomfortable situations to try and learn the other stuff, to be a well-rounded fighter. Now I feel like we're in this third generation of mixed martial artists that saw us, that saw what we were doing, and said, that's what I want to be. They don't care about a belt, they don't care about any of that. They've trained to be well-rounded mixed martial artists, and I think that's the athletes that you're seeing fight now.
Could you see that happening around you? Because at the time, there were guys that had long careers like yourself, like Vito Belfort, Chuck, Tito. They all went into it where it was regarded as a professional sport. It wasn't just modern day Mortal Kombat with guys wearing Tito looked like a Mortal Kombat character with the flame shorts and the bleach blonde hair, but it wasn't about being a character. It was a real respectful sport. And did you notice and pinpoint the guys they're in it for the long run, they want to raise the game and make this a sport?
Well, you certainly see the guys that you competed against and that you see on the cards all the time being diligent, putting work in, treating it as a profession, being smart about their training, smart about their approach and their lifestyle for the sport. And those were the guys you knew were probably going to be around for a while.
Because you had trilogies with both Chuck and Vito Belfort. Every time that you won a belt and every time that you lost a belt, you scratch and claw to get that belt back. 6-time UFC champion. What do you put down that mindset to, that you would never give up every time an adversity was in your way?
I think just being resilient, recognizing that, and I've said this before, if the worst thing that ever happened to me in my life was I lost a fight, I was doing pretty damn good. But keeping it in perspective, wasn't going to be the end of the world. The people that really mattered to me and really cared about me weren't going anywhere just because I lost the fight. And most of the people that cared about that sort of thing didn't really probably matter in your life. So trying to keep it simple, do it out of the passion for the sport, and hell, I lost some of the biggest wrestling matches on the planet. I think it's a volatile sport. That mindset and that prepared me for the volatile sport of mixed martial arts. So winning and losing it's all part of it. It's all part of the journey. I never got too wrapped up and worried about whether I was going to win or lose. I was going to go out and do the very best I could, do everything I trained to do, and whatever the result was, I could live with that. I was okay with that. The people that really mattered, the people that really loved me were still going to be there. The sun was coming up the next day regardless.
It's an absolute testament to you as a fighter, because when you look at the guys that dominate, like Tim Sylvia, GSP, they had adversity to overcome, but every time you face adversity, like I said, even your retirement, you retired after the Liddell fight and you were counted out in the Tim Sylvia fight when you returned, and what an amazing performance that was. Just talk about that win, because any doubters that you had, you shut them right up with that performance.
Yeah, after the third Chuck fight, I was going through a divorce. The divorce had been dragging on and just didn't feel like myself. I didn't feel like I was getting the training in, and a lot of things were going on. Felt like I needed to step away and kind of let the dust settle. Once the divorce was final and the dust kind of settled, I started feeling more like myself. I got into the grappling competition, professional submission league against Jacare, and that kind of got the competitive juices flowing again. And offhandedly text Dana White about the boring fight between Tim Sylvia and Jeff Munson. It was like watching paint dry. And I said, man, I could beat either one of those guys. And he didn't even text me back. He just called me. He said, are you serious? I said, hell yes, I'm serious. 3 weeks later, the Tim Sylvia fight was signed. So obviously at 44, a lot of people thought I was already over the hill. I shouldn't be fighting a guy, certainly a guy that big. But I felt confident that I could beat Tim. I had trained with Tim for a couple of weeks at Team Quest. He stayed at my house. He was a great guy. I really liked him. We were friends. And I knew that was going to be a problem for him. He's one of those guys that had to run his mouth and generate some animosity to be able to go out and do his job, to be able to go out and win fights. I never had that issue. I had to wrestle and fight some of my best friends almost on a daily basis. So I never had to generate that animosity or that kind of mindset to go out and do my job. And I knew that would be a psychological issue for Tim. He was going to have trouble talking shit about me, trying to run me down or piss me off going into that fight. That was his MO. And obviously it was a huge crowd at that time. That was the biggest crowd we'd had in North America, at about 22,000 people. Crazy. And I was never that knockout style fighter. I never knocked anybody out in a single fight. Tim was the closest I came to that one punch knockout. That first overhand right, I used that left inside kick to set up and break his balance to set up the overhand right. I was supposed to follow that with a left hook, but he fell down. I was surprised as everybody when Tim fell over. So the entire crowd jumped up in that moment, and I don't think they sat down the rest of that fight. It was a crazy night, but it was certainly one of my favorite fights for sure. That crowd was amazing.
Because you could arguably say that there was a similar scenario with the first Chuck fight as well. It's no secret that Dana wanted to build the company around Chuck and have him as his big star. You derailed that hype train for a while, for a period of time, with your superior grappling and ground and pound. Was that a sweet one to get as well, whenever you counted out to get a win like that on the biggest stage possible?
Yeah, that was an important one for sure. I studied Chuck. And in many ways, I found myself in that same situation a lot in my career. The first time I fought Vitor Belfort, he's this 19-year-old that's literally tearing through everybody. And I was, 34 years old. By most people's estimation, 34 was already too old for a combative sport. So it was a huge underdog in that fight. And knew if I could get my hands on him and make him wrestle me, I had a good chance of wearing him out and winning. And it turned out that game plan worked. And that kind of set the tone for my entire career, kind of being that underdog, a lot of times just because of my age. And the first Chuck fight was no different. Dana, you know, kind of always liked to root against me, bet against me. I was kind of a pain in their ass when it came to contracts and ancillary rights and fighter pay and some of those things that you're hearing more guys chirp about now. I was that guy back then that was chirping about that stuff. And one of the reasons why I'm persona non grata with the UFC and Dana White now is because of that. But they kept counting me out. They were sure Pedro Hizzo was going to beat me. They were sure Chuck was going to beat me. I think he was probably sure Tito was going to beat me as well. And it just didn't work out that way. I was the fly in the ointment for them, so to speak.
The heavyweight division at the time was absolutely incredible, as was the light heavyweight division in the UFC. But when you look at what Pride were doing at that time, for one reason or another, you mentioned, you know, Dana had a real soft spot for Chuck, because Chuck got to fight in a couple of one-off fights in Pride. Was that something you thought, man, I would have loved to have competed in that Pride heavyweight division?
Actually, the deal was, when I agreed to fight Chuck the first time, the loser of that match was going to get to go fight in that Pride Grand Prix tournament. Chuck lost, so Chuck was the one that went to Pride and fought. I was the champ. He wasn't going to put me in over there. Yeah. And so that was how that worked. Pride did offer me a contract at one point. It was a cash offer, and it was a decent, you know, as far as the money went, it was a pretty good offer. But in my mind, it made more sense for me to stay in the American market. You know, one of my best friends, Dan Henderson, fought a ton in Pride, and he was a lot less well-known and had a lot less sponsors and stuff because he was fighting in the Japanese market. He wasn't fighting in the American market. So even though the Pride offer was a good cash offer, it was better for me to stay in the U.S. and stay with the UFC. They weren't paying me as much as Pride offered me, but I was making up the difference in the endorsements and the other stuff in the American marketplace. So that was kind of how that decision went for me. I cornered Dan for a lot of those fights. I went to a lot of those Prides. They were something. They were a special event. The way they set it up, it was very unique. And the Japanese crowd is a whole different animal in and of itself. You can literally hear a pin drop in the arena. They're so quiet. It's almost eerie to fight in front of a Japanese crowd like that.
That was a big storyline in those early 2010 was, is Randy Couture going to fight Fedor Emelianenko?
Yeah.
If you go to the video game section over there, they've got you on the cover. Remember the EA Sports MMA game? You guys doing all the promotion for that. Was there ever a point in your career where that seemed like it was realistic that it could have happened?
Yeah, it was a fight I chased for about 13 months. Obviously, I retired after the third Chuck fight. I came back. I fought Tim, came out of retirement, fought Tim, and then I got into another rhubarb with Dana and Lorenzo and the company and stepped away from the sport, resigned the heavyweight title because that was the fight I wanted. Most of the rankings had Fedor ranked #1 in the heavyweight division and I was ranked #2. I'm like, fuck that, that's the guy I want to fight. You guys make it happen. Find a way to make that fight happen. They couldn't make that fight happen. And there were some other things going on at that time too with the company that I wasn't very pleased about. So I stepped away. They weren't going to be able to make the fight happen. I stepped away, said, you guys can have your belt back. I'm going to find a way to make this fight happen. Mark Cuban owned American Airlines Arena. He also had his own fight show and fight promotion. So I kind of teamed up with him, and he was trying to help me negotiate with Fedor and find a way to make that fight happen. And then that kind of fell through. They filed injunctions against me to keep me from fighting anywhere else. Affliction jumped on board. You know, they chastised Affliction. I was an Affliction guy and a brand ambassador for them. And they also manufactured Extreme Couture clothing. And we were sponsoring about 30 fighters at that time through our clothing companies. And as a backlash for me kind of stepping out and trying to make the Fedor fight happen, they canceled basically Affliction as a sponsor and Extreme Couture clothing as a sponsor to any of those fighters. And so Affliction and Todd Beard, the owner of Affliction, kind of gave them a big FU and said, all right, we'll start our own promotion. And so they started Affliction promotion, and they were trying to make the Fedor fight happen there. And Fedor actually fought for them twice out of their 3 shows, and then they kind of went bankrupt on spending that kind of money on a fight promotion. But I almost thought it was going to happen with Affliction. It was never going to happen. The clock was ticking for me. I was approaching my mid-40s, and at some point I had to say, okay, this fight, there's just no way I'm going to get around all this legal bullshit to make this fight happen. But I want to finish out my career. I want to continue to fight. So I came back, fought Brock after that period when it was realistically the Fedor fight was just never going to happen. So, and then finished out the last 3 years of my career with the UFC.
You mentioned Brock there. He was a big crossover star, and they ended up building the company around him for the next couple of years after that. Just in terms of all the guys that you faced, did anything, what set him apart? What was his punch power like? And
the biggest thing with Brock is he's a huge guy. I mean, he walks around at 295 pounds. He had to cut 30 pounds just to get to the 265 limit for the heavyweight division. It wasn't just that he was a huge guy, he's a very athletic man. He had a great wrestling pedigree as a national champion from Minnesota University in collegiate wrestling. And so he had that wrestling pedigree. And I knew anytime I faced another wrestler, it was going to be a tougher fight. Because that in some ways negated a lot of my strength. My wrestling background was a lot of the strength in my fighting style. So neutralizing that, facing another wrestler posed significant problems. Now, who learned the other stuff better? That was going to be the difference in the fight. I think I had Brock going. I think I was on my way to winning and beating him in that fight. Would have been interesting in that first round had he not grabbed the cage when I had him up. If I'd have put him on his back, it might have been a different night altogether, but I guess we'll never know.
And then the year after that, you got the 2009 fight of the year against Nogueira. Absolute dream match, UFC versus Pride. You like you said, you were in your mid-40s at that time, and the stamina and attrition and grit that you had was like that of a late 20s, early 30-year-old. Like, what do you put down your health to at that point?
I think because I had been wrestling for the national team for so long at a high level, when I transitioned into MMA, that fitness level was already really high. I was a more mature athlete in my 30s. I didn't do the dumb shit I did in my 20s. I didn't party, you're either celebrating or commiserating a win or a loss in every wrestling tournament or fight. And then what are you doing? You're out celebrating, you're out partying, and you're praying for a week or two before you actually get back in the gym and start training again. So you have these big ups and downs as you're younger. I was an older athlete. I wasn't interested in partying. I wasn't interested in any of that stuff. So I think my fitness level stayed a lot more level through that time, and that allowed me the peaks. And it allowed me to avoid a bunch of injuries, trying to get yourself back up in shape. That's where a lot of those injuries tended to occur. And I avoided all that just by being a little more mature and a little older fighter. You learn to train smarter, not harder. And thankfully, you don't do the dumb shit you do when you're younger.
2011, you hung up the gloves, you retired. Must have been a really, really tough decision, and you stuck by that decision. A lot of guys come out of retirement and get tempted and want to carry on fighting. Was there ever any temptation for you? Were there any ever offers on the table?
I had already kind of done that. I retired after the third Chuck fight, came back out, and then I was getting ready to fight James Toney in 2008 in Boston. And for some reason in that camp, every old injury I'd ever had flared up. In '88, I had Achilles tendonitis really bad, running a bunch, cutting weight to make the Olympic trials, and that tendonitis came back during that camp. My elbow that I had tweaked in wrestling, my neck, every old injury I'd ever had flared up for no particular reason in that camp. And that was the first time that little voice, I call him my crazy roommate, he started chirping, saying, yeah, maybe your body's talking to you, telling you it's time to do something else. And I think once you start having that internal dialogue with yourself, you really have to take it seriously and think that maybe it's time to do something else. So it took me a couple years to come to terms with the fact that it was probably time to move on. I had some great fights in that stretch, after James Toney Lyoto came after that, and I didn't really want to go out on a guy like James. Frankly, I wanted to have a real mixed martial arts fight, not just taking down some boxer. And so Lyoto was the fight that I decided, okay, this is it. He's that Rubik's Cube in MMA, trying to solve his style and figure him out. And I thought that was a good one to go out, win, lose, or draw. I was going to retire. Didn't tell a lot of people that because it would have taken on a life of its own. And didn't want that pressure or that headache. So I just kind of kept it to myself. But I did that book, The Last Round. Actually, Fiaz is from here in Manchester. He's the one that helped me publish that book. And I did the book signing here in 2011 with Fiaz after that, The Last Round, based on that camp, because I knew it was going to be my last fight. So it took me a while to come to terms with that transition. Thankfully for me, was pretty smooth because I had already started acting. I had something to go right into to focus my energy and my competitive instinct on something else. A lot of athletes and soldiers and other professionals, they struggle in that transition because they don't have a new purpose. They don't have that next thing that's going to occupy their mind and their body. So that's going to be a real challenge. Thankfully for me, in the transitions I had in my life, they were pretty smooth.
You couldn't have picked a better part to start your acting career as well. A who's who of action heroes: Stallone, Bruce Willis, Schwarzenegger, Jean-Claude Van Damme in the second Expendables movie. Yeah. You are an expendable, and there's a fourth one coming out as well, isn't there?
Yeah, we just finished the fourth one here in December. We shot in London for a few weeks. We shot in Bulgaria, we shot in Greece. Expendables 4 is going to be a little bit different than some of the other ones, but I think it's going to be good. I think everybody's going to like it. We added some new cast members. The only 4 original ones, Stallone, Statham, Dolph Lundgren, and myself, are the only 4 original Expendables left. We brought in 50 Cent, Curtis Johnson for this one, Megan Fox, Andy Garcia, Desha, Tony Jai. There's some really, really good people in this, so I think you guys will like it. Hopefully in this next year it'll be out.
How awesome was it to be around guys like Stallone? Jason Statham's a massive MMA fan as well. I'm sure you guys have had a lot of conversations. I've seen him at a lot of UFC shows. They're the Hollywood badasses with the real life badass.
Well, they're a great group of guys. A great group of guys to work with, to be around. It felt a lot like being on your old team. Back with the guys in the locker room, telling jokes, suiting up, getting ready to go out and perform. It felt a lot like that. It's like old home week when we get back together, getting the band back together.